stepping on board with us tonight. We are delighted to have Dr. Alan Williams joining us. I don't think he needs much of an introduction. That's why we kind of post it ahead of time. People can research who we are bringing on board, but Dr. Alan Williams has a very good standing and history within the small ruminant, large ruminant, you name it. He's a master of all. So yeah, grazing systems, I figured it'd be a great opportunity to bring somebody on board to explain his point of view on how he sees things being managed, and we'll just kind of go from there. So without further ado, Alan, if you want to kick it off and run through grazing systems, grazing management, that's going to be our main point of emphasis tonight. So it's all yours, partner.
Okay, well, thank you, Luke, and good evening, everyone. I'm gonna go through just a handful of things and give you some examples and so forth, but I do want to leave a lot of time for a Q&A tonight, because I think really most of the time that's the most important part. Yeah, everything revolves around context, and so questions within your context are going to be something that I really want to pay a lot of attention to. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing screen here. Well, if I can get it to come up, Luke.
It's starting to come, I think.
Yeah, I don't know why it's so slow here. I'm going to go almost, well, it's not want to do anything at all. All right, I'm going to go back and I got it to do stop share. I'm going to try it again.
I just made you a co-host. Maybe that'll help.
Ah, there you go. There you go. Okay.
Sorry about that.
Not a problem. Okay. Oops. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good deal. All right. So I call adaptive grazing the genesis of ecosystem restoration. I've been doing this since all the 1990s or so, when I started to get some epiphanies in terms of different ways of grazing. I was a very conventional grazer, and as a university professor at that point in time in my life, I also taught a lot of conventional grazing applications and so forth. I will say that over the last 30 years, we've learned a ton, and I'm going to share with you this evening some of that. So for us, this is really what it's all about. Okay. It's about creating the habitat for as much life as we possibly can. Because what we have absolutely found is that as we create that habitat for all types of life, our grazing gets significantly better as well. Our animal performance gets better, animal health gets better. Everything improves quite dramatically. It's also about restoring a fully functioning carbon cycle. This is really, really important, and it's something that that adaptive grazing really hones in on. Carbon is meant to cycle, in spite of what we hear in today's world, where everybody's talking about, hey, let's just invent something to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and sock it away into the soil, never to be heard from again. That's wholly incorrect. That is not the way carbon needs to work. Carbon needs to cycle. That's what it's meant to do. And with regenerative agriculture and adaptive grazing, this is what we're attempting to do. Now, what we have absolutely discovered is this. As we move along the continuum from what we call continuous grazing, what most people do, to even typical rotational grazing, to adaptive grazing, what we see is life explodes, and it starts with life beneath the soil and then expands to life above. So this is one of the key things that we have to understand. If we really want to improve what's happening in our soils, on our land, in our pastures, with our livestock, it's all going to start beneath our feet first, not above it, not above it. And I spent way too many years myself focusing solely on everything happening above the soil surface and paying very little attention to what was going on beneath my feet until I totally switched the way that I thought and reversed it and started focusing on what was going on in the soil first. That's when everything radically changed for the better. So to do this, we use what we now call the 6-3-4. And I'll just go through this very briefly and then get into some specific examples for you. But the 6-3-4 is comprised of the 6 principles of soil health, the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, and the 4 ecosystem processes. And this is really how we make grazing systems or cropping systems. If a number of you on the webinar also have cropping operations, this applies regardless of your agricultural or agronomic enterprise. I'll go through these again pretty quickly. The first principle is context. We have to first clearly define our context. And context is comprised of absolutely everything you can possibly think about. It's comprised of your goals and objectives, both financial and production. It's comprised of your family dynamics, your employee dynamics. It's comprised of the history of your farm or ranch, including even what we call the historical ecological context, not just what has happened in more recent history, but what happened on that land 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Believe it or not, that actually matters relative to the potential for today on your land. So we can't ignore that. So all of that comprises context. Then the other 5 principles must be applied within your specific farm or ranch context. If you're not applying them within your context, you're going to fail. And I'll just say that straight out. You can't, there's 2 things you can't do here. You can't not apply these other principles within your context because it won't work if you're not applying them within your context. And the second thing you can't do is cherry pick and say, well, I sort of like number 2 and number 5 there, but I don't really care about the others. They all go hand in hand. They're symbiotic. So we have to apply all 6. So principle number 2 is do not disturb, minimize disturbance. Now, this obviously means things like minimize tillage, minimize application of synthetic fertilizers or even too much applied manures, minimize chemical application, but it also means minimize overgrazing or grazing any one pasture too frequently, or too much pharmaceuticals used on our livestock. All of those create issues in the soil, not just elsewhere. So minimize disturbance. Number 3, keep the soil covered at all times. We don't want bare soil or pastures where our grasses are too short. Those soils will heat up way too quickly and way hotter than you may think they will. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And you'll lose a lot of your moisture through evapotranspiration if you're not protecting that soil surface. The 4th one is diversity. We need as much diversity as possible. And this is diversity in everything we can think about. We need diversity in the plant species that are growing in our pastures or on our rangeland. We need diversity, preferably in our livestock species, not just a single species. We need diversity in our beneficial insects, pollinators, bird species, and microbial species beneath the soil. And the 5th one is keep living roots in the soil at all times. And this is possible no matter where you are. And I know a lot of you are from all over the country, but we're keeping living roots in the soil, and up in Canada and Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Alberta provinces and in many other places. And then finally, number 6 is integrating animals, integrating livestock. And I'm assuming almost everybody on the webinar tonight does this, since this is a webinar focusing on sheep. So you are integrating animals into this system. So those are the 6 principles. The 3 rules of adaptive stewardship are the rule of compounding. And very quickly, the definition of this is there are no singular effects in nature and in biology. So on our farms, on our ranches, and even within our own personal lives and relationships, there are no singular effects. Everything that happens, every management practice we apply or maybe don't apply, causes a whole series of compounding, cascading effects, whether we realize it or not. And these effects are never neutral. They're either positive or negative. So this rule is a rule of recognition. We have to recognize that there is a rule of compounding, and it's at play every day. And the way that we think and the way that we implement our practices and our management needs to be such that we're thinking about how do I create positive compounding effects rather than negative compounding effects. And this even applies to epigenetics. And I'm not going to dig into epigenetics right now, but if you have any questions about that in the Q&A session, we can certainly talk about epigenetics as well. The second rule of adaptive stewardship is diversity. So we saw diversity in the 6 principles, and now we see diversity in the 3 rules. That's how important it is. It's in both the principles and the rules. And then the third rule is the rule of disruption. And the rule of disruption means this, that if we're doing things the same way all the time, in a prescriptive or formulaic manner, in other words, if our grazing is pretty much prescriptive, we're doing the same thing over and over and over again. Grazing, we have the same number of days in between rest and recovery before we're back grazing a paddock again. We're putting them on at the same height, taking them off at the same height of the forage, things like that. That's prescriptive. And anytime we're prescriptive, we're going to stagnate. Nature is going to stagnate. Everything's going to stagnate out there, and you're going to stop making progress. And then soon things are going to start going backwards. So to prevent that from happening, there are planned, purposeful disruptions that we can implement that allow us to be able to make ongoing incremental progress. The way I like to illustrate this is to use an analogy. If you think of a human athlete, okay, for a human athlete to compete at a very high level, day in and day out, to compete for championships or in the Olympics for gold medals, they cannot do the same exercise routine at the same duration and intensity day in and day out. If they do, they're going to hit a wall and they're going to stop making progress. So every athlete knows that to continue to make ongoing progress, they have to routinely disrupt their exercise routine. They have to change the duration, the intensity, whatever, so that they can continue to challenge their bodies and challenge their minds. So if we're biology and we work that way and we need disruption to continue to improve, so does all the biology that we're working with on our farms and on our ranches. So the rule of disruption absolutely applies here, except just like in our exercise routine, we do planned, purposeful disruptions. On our farms and ranches, we can also do planned, purposeful disruptions. And a little later on, I'll go through what some of those are. And then the 4 ecosystem processes are the 4 things that are still free to us every day. We don't have to pay for any of these things. And they are energy flow, photosynthetic activity. Way too many farms and ranches today are not maximizing photosynthetic capture. That's the only way you're creating energy out there in your pastures and on your rangeland is through photosynthetic capture. So if we have sunlight that's hitting the soil before being intercepted by a plant leaf, the solar panel of a plant, that is wasted sunlight. And we do not want wasted sunlight. So we want to optimize that. Water cycle is another one of the 4 ecosystem processes. And today, unfortunately, we have a pretty broken water cycle. Mineral cycle, again, just like the water cycle, we have a broken mineral cycle. And then the last one is diversity, also known as community dynamics. So you'll notice again, diversity was in the 6 principles, the 3 rules, and it's part of the 4 ecosystem processes. So again, diversity cannot be emphasized enough. And this is probably one of the things that we lack the most in our modern day agricultural systems. So let me go to some real life examples. Let me share with you some of the work that we're doing and some of the results that we're seeing. And that's what I'm going to share with you right now is the timeline for building significant and deep soil aggregation, no matter where you're located in the US or North America or even the world. This timeline still applies. So this data is aggregated from quite a few of our clients' farms and ranches. Now, the pictures that you're seeing right now were all taken in year 1. So I'm going to go through from year 1 through year 4 of implementing regenerative principles and adaptive grazing. So these pictures were taken in year 1 as all of these folks were beginning their application of regenerative principles and adaptive grazing. And you'll see that all of these soils have issues. This is called the shovel test, and we do this frequently, take divots out of the soil, and you'll see that these soils are crusted on the top. They have plated and compacted layers, very little aggregation, and they are not infiltrating and retaining water very well. The roots aren't penetrating very deeply as well because of the heavy compaction. Again, same things occurring here and the same things occurring here. So this is what we don't want soil to look like. This is not healthy soil. Okay, this is soil that's got a lot of problems. So what do we want soil to look like? This is what we want it to look like. So here you see soils that have large aggregates going down deep into that soil profile. And you see aggregates even clinging to the roots. We call those dingleberries, and you see root hairs that are coated by soil. We call those the dreadlocks of the soil. So we want to see this in highly functioning, biologically active soil. And so here again, you can see how deep this aggregate layer is going on a number of our clients' farms and ranches after the first 4 years of implementing these regenerative and adaptive practices. And again, here, another example of the depth of the aggregate in that soil pit, and you see the clinging of the aggregates to the roots. So we really don't want to see clean roots. Clean roots are a sign of a soil that is not functioning well. Soil that is functioning well will have what I call dirty roots, roots that are coated in soil, coated in aggregates. So let's look at the first 4 years, what happened. So in year 1, across all of these farms and ranches that we were analyzing, the average aggregate depth was only 2.3 inches. By year 2, it had pretty much doubled to 4.5 inches. So that's really good progress in a single year. By year 3, we'd increased it to 6.2 inches. Again, very good linear progress. But look what happened by year 4. All of these took a pretty big leap between year 3 and year 4, and increased from 6.2 to 14.7 inches of aggregate depth on average. Now, on every one of these, we told them in year 3, when we were on their farms and ranches and doing this analysis, and I even wrote this in their written reports in year 3, you have built enough microbiological biomass and profile that you should now be ready for exponential growth and results. And I told them to expect that. And sure enough, when we got back there on year 4, that's exactly what we saw. That's exactly what we observed, this exponential growth. We went from linear in years 1, 2, and 3 to exponential. So it takes building enough biomass for this exponential effect to begin to occur. Here's what we also saw in terms of microbial population. Their total fungi population increased by an average of 176%. Their mycorrhizal fungi population increased 153%, and their saprophytic fungi population increased 199% over that 4-year time period. And here are some of the other benefits. They saw significantly enhanced water infiltration and retention, far greater forage biomass production, while adding additional plant species, insect, and bird diversity, significantly better animal health, enhanced animal performance, and better nutrient cycling in the soil. So all of those were benefits that we noted over that 4-year period. Now, let me walk you through 3 different regions of the country and some what I think are very significant things that happened to the producers in these 3 regions as a result of implementing these practices. Let's start in the Central Valley of California. Now, these are typical almond and walnut orchards in the Central Valley. And you can drive for mile after mile and take a lot of pictures like these. To me, this is a sick, broken system. It's all bare soil under the trees, but they're taught to do it this way because what they're being taught is that if you have anything growing underneath these trees, it's going to rob the trees of nutrients and water. So we need to have trees only and nothing else. But that creates a very sick and highly input-driven system. This is an orchard at one of the universities there in California, and they consider this to be their model orchard, their research orchard, for helping, these walnut and almond growers to learn how to do this. And the people that you see here are one of our Soil Health Academy classes. So we went out into this university orchard, and here's what we found. We tried to do the shovel test, and we really needed a pickaxe to be able to get through the soil here. It was very, very hard to dig in the soil. It was very heavily compacted and plated. We stuck an infiltration ring in the ground, and 2 hours later, no water had infiltrated. And we found out from the people at the university, the staff and all of that were managing this orchard, that it was routinely sprayed with some type of pesticide anywhere from 12 to 15 times a year. And they were using a lot of irrigation and applying a lot of synthetic fertility. So can we do this very differently? Well, the answer is yes. So this is a nut orchard in that same Central Valley of California, less than 30 miles away from where that university orchard was located. This particular grower, his name is Daniel Unruh. Daniel attended his first Soil Health Academy in 2018, and his orchard looked like the pictures of all those others up until 2018. So he was doing it very conventionally up until that point. But after he attended the Soil Health Academy and learned the principles and the rules and the ecosystem processes, he radically altered what he was doing. And he went in and he planted a highly diverse cover crop mix, and things just exploded from there. Now, one of the things that he experienced or he was experiencing prior to that point was a significant root eating nematode problem. So he had a lot of nematodes eating the roots of his walnut trees, and he had tried numerous nematicides to control the nematodes, and nothing was really working. But he found when he planted this diverse cover crop, his nematode problem went away. And that's because some of the species in the cover crop actually produce natural nematicides that work far better than the synthetic nematicides that he was buying and applying. So this was the beginning. Then you can see, what is, additional pictures of his orchards and what they look like. And then he did this. So we added a whole bunch of sheep, up to 1,000 head of ewes, to his orchards. He's running these behind a single strand of polywire, moving them every day. So he's making daily moves through the orchards with the sheep. The sheep are now supplying his fertility. So he no longer is buying and applying synthetic fertilizers. The sheep are supplying all the fertility and biology that his orchard needs for those trees to be healthy and for him to have a thriving walnut crop. In addition, the sheep are supplying another source of revenue off of the exact same acres. Prior to this, the only revenue he derived per acre was from the walnut crop. Now he's able to sell walnuts and other value-added products like walnut oil and that kind of thing, plus the lamb, plus he's also added bees, so he's now selling honey as well. So he's got a lot of different things that have increased his revenue generation. He has drastically reduced his reliance on irrigation because with the addition of the sheep and the complex covers, he has been able to build that soil aggregate that I showed you earlier and infiltrate and retain water a lot better. That's very important here in the Central Valley. And he has radically reduced any type of pesticide application as well. So again, you see, some of the results here, and both his trees and his nut crops are far healthier. This is another farm in the Central Valley, the Burris family farm. They're actually hosting a Soil Health Academy coming up in April of this year. And you can see they're doing something very, very similar. They're growing both almonds and walnuts, and they are also using sheep in their orchards for added revenue and fertility and biology and all of that. And I'm thankful to report that the university, whose orchard we visited the year prior, I don't know whether they got embarrassed or they just got a good idea or what, but they now are starting to plant and experiment with cover crops in their orchards as well. So we were very happy to see that. The second location in North America I want to go to is the Chihuahuan Desert. So let's see what can happen in the desert with adaptive grazing. This is what the Chihuahuan Desert typically looks like across broad expanses of it. This is what it can look like. That's the same desert. That's the same desert, okay? So let me walk you through a timeline here. So this is the Las Damas Ranch, and this picture was taken 2 years after they began adaptive grazing practices on the ranch. You can see that they're starting to get more plant growth, more soil covered, a lot less bare ground, and there was no irrigation. So what I want you to know is what did not happen here. No irrigation, no seed planted. So everything you're going to see over this time-lapse photography that has grown here resulted from the latent seed mite from what was already there in the soil and responded to the adaptive grazing. And their only tools were simply movement of livestock, cattle and sheep, and even burrows, and water for the livestock. And that was it. So this is what it looked like in 2015. This is what it looked like by 2018. And oh, by the way, the average rainfall here on the Las Damas is only 6 to 8 inches a year. That's it. Okay. And again, zero irrigation. So they're doing this on 6 to 8 inches of rain a year. This is 2021. So remember that timeline I showed you earlier in years 1 through 4 in building aggregate? Well, you can see that the same thing happened here. Okay. We were building biology in the soil and beginning to tap that latent seed bank. And by this point, 2021, we saw explosive or exponential growth. And that's because this ranch had now built sufficient critical microbial biomass for the exponential effects to occur. So over that time period, here is what happened. The Las Damas Ranch increased their net profits by 350%, while growing 4.5 times more forage biomass, adding 2.5 times more livestock to the ranch, both cattle and sheep, and again, burrows. So they're grazing all three. And they saw an explosion in wildlife, including many threatened and endangered species of birds that found the habitat they needed on these regenerative ranches and are now repopulating. So that's what we saw in the desert. Now, let's go to a third location. Let's go to the southeastern U.S. And here what we did was we assembled a team of scientists, and I'm on that team of scientists personally, and we did paired comparisons on neighboring farms throughout multiple states in the Southeast. And we measured a whole host of things from beneath the soil to above the soil over a multi-year period. So I want to share with you some of the key data results from this research. And again, these were all neighboring, next door neighbor farms. Okay, so I want you to understand that. These are direct next door neighbors that we were measuring. One operating with adaptive grazing and regenerative principles, and the other conventional. So we were making the direct comparison between regenerative and conventional on each one of these. And we told both of them, don't change anything you're doing, just keep doing it the way you're doing it now. So first, we deployed eddy covariance flux towers, and we had 24/7 measurement of greenhouse gas fluxes, as well as weather data, soil moisture, soil temperature, all of that. And we measured soil carbon and so forth. What we found was that the regenerative farms were a 4 times more powerful carbon sink. And this included not just carbon, but also methane and nitrous oxide. So all 3 of those greenhouse gases were included in these measurements. So again, the regenerative ones were a 4 times more powerful carbon sink, drawing down an average of 12.1 tons per hectare per year of CO2 equivalent. We noted 3 times more grassland birds on the regenerative farms compared to their immediate next door neighbors. On the regenerative farms, our bird team averaged counting 442 birds of 9 species to 152 birds of 6 species on the conventional. And again, there was nothing but fences separating the neighbors. We saw 33% more insect species diversity and 25% more microbial species diversity on these regenerative farms compared to the next door neighbors. And relative to effective rainfall is a rainfall that your soil is actually infiltrating and retaining instead of it ponding and pooling and running off or evaporating. So this is rainfall you're actually capturing so that your plants and your soils can use it. And we noted that the regenerative farms were a 2.3 times more powerful infiltrator. They infiltrated 2.3 times more water rainfall per acre per hour compared to the conventional. Now, what does that mean? That means that 2 inches per acre per hour is an additional 54,000 gallons of water per acre that you're storing for every acre. Now, that's pretty significant, folks. And for those of you that live in drier country, more arid country, this is absolutely huge. But even for me, here in Mississippi, this is huge as well. All of this was also filmed, this entire research multi-year project from the very beginning to the very end. And there's a 4-part documentary series called Roots So Deep. It is a very powerful documentary, and I highly encourage each of you to watch this documentary. You can go to rootsodeep.org and schedule a viewing if you want to. So I really, really encourage that. You will love the documentary. So what I want to do now is I'm going to go to the rule of disruption and what we can do there, because this is really where the rubber meets the road. And then I'm going to open it up for Q&A, and you can ask questions within your very specific context. So the way that you're going to make ongoing and rapid progress is through the rule of disruption. Absolutely no doubt about it. This is critically important. Again, this is where the rubber meets the road, okay? And what we find, again, is that nature has tremendous resilience and responds quite well to challenges. So we can introduce planned, purposeful disruptions to be able to create a host of positive compounding effects. And flexibility is the key with adaptive grazing. So we do not want to do things the same way every time. Adaptive grazing, adaptive management is not a routine, a recipe, or a formula. So the question then is, how can we very specifically be disruptive? So here are some of the key ways in grazing that we can be disruptive. So one of the first is that we can alter stock densities, not stocking rate. Do not confuse stocking rate and stocking density. Stocking rate is number of animals per acre or number of acres per animal. Okay, that's stocking rate. Stock density is total pounds of animal per acre. Very, very different than stocking rate. So we want to alter those stock densities, or the pounds of animal per acre. I call this pulsing of stock density. Number 2, alter your rotation patterns. Do not rotate your sheep, your cattle, whatever you're grazing, in the same pattern year after year across your farm or ranch. Alter that rotational grazing pattern. Alter the grazing heights on and off. This is very important. If you're always thinking, I've got to go on at a certain height and come off at a certain height, that's highly prescriptive, and you're going to stagnate, period. There's no option other than to stagnate. Alter rest periods. This is another thing that absolutely has to happen to make ongoing progress. Also, if you alter rest periods, particularly giving longer rest periods, this is where you're going to greatly increase the soil microbial population and diversity and plant species population and diversity as well. This will allow you to grow a lot more biomass and have a lot more plant species diversity out there. If you're grazing multi-species, alter species order in your grazing rotation from time to time. Alter time of season or year a paddock is grazed, and even the total number of days that you may graze it in a year. Alter paddock configuration or shape. This is important as well. If you have the same shape paddock time after time on the same acre, same place, that's prescriptive. This is where temporary fencing or even herding comes into play. Alter paddock configuration. You do not get the same impact from a square paddock as you do from a long, narrow paddock. Even with the same stock density and the same acres covered in the paddock, the shape of the paddock matters in terms of the impact you're going to get from the livestock. Alter paddock direction. If you're always building your paddocks in the same direction, north to south every time, next year change them to east to west. That matters, and it matters a lot. Bale grazing can be a planned purposeful disruption. Planned burns is another one. Leader follower grazing is another one. Contour grazing. So if you have contour, if you're not flat and you have some topography changes, then contour grazing is very powerful. And with contour grazing, what you want to do is you want to build your paddocks following the contour, and you always want to start your grazing low in the meadows and the bottoms in the valleys and move up the contour. Never start up and move down. Always start low and move high. Okay. Why? Because over the decades and even over the centuries, through the combination of erosion and other things, you've got more biology, more carbon, more diversity low than you do high. So you can use your livestock, your cattle, your sheep, whatever, to move that diversity and that biology from the low areas up slope, up onto the ridges. And then finally, you can use combinations of disruptions. And this is incredibly powerful. So let me give you an example. I can, in the same grazing event, I can alter stock density. I can alter my paddock configuration, and I can alter my rest period. So I have combined 3 different disruptions into a single grazing event. That produces even faster results. So, Luke, with that, I'm going to stop right there and open it up for Q&A.
Thank you very much for that, Alan. And the visuals were very, very powerful for anybody asking, what their grazing systems can do and how they can manage them. That's pretty powerful and pretty telling stuff there for anybody to follow. And I think a lot of times we get so specific in our questions or our grazing systems that we miss the whole system together. We try to fine tune it and finesse it, but we really miss the whole grand scheme of things here. And I think the diversity piece of it too, really stood out to me is, anybody that's just a small ruminant producer only on here, we're going to stagnate with our grazing systems over time. We can only do so many disruptions with that. So a way to add diversity into that to help with that is, these nut trees, these orchards, things like that. And what an awesome way to increase revenue too. So definitely some market opportunities there. But I'm really interested to see what kind of questions we have coming here, Alan. And I think we'll open it up. So please feel free to unmute yourself, ask away. This is a great opportunity to essentially be face to face with one of the nation's best here. And like I say, we welcome any questions you folks have.
Alan, this is Dan Heilman, row crop and livestock sheep operation in Iowa. What have you found to be the most disruptive method of implementing these types of systems or approaches to a row crop operation? I am doing some cover cropping. Would love to be able to convert all my acres to perennial pastures, but I'm up against obligations financially to meet. So here I have a system, and I want to know what you found to be most disruptive and most effective that you've seen?
So very good question, Dan, and appreciate that. And thank you for giving me that context of what you're doing and where you're located. So some of the things that we have found to work very, very well in terms of rules of disruption. What can you do to disrupt what you're doing and to really make some good progress? Number one is make sure that you've got good, diverse cover crop mixes. So diversity in the cover crop matters, and you want to make sure that you're considering your resource concerns in between your cash crops and planting cover crops that address those resource concerns. And that includes things like, the nutrients that you're going to need for the next cash crop. It includes your carbon to nitrogen ratio in the soil. It includes the herbicide regime that you used with the prior cash crop and how that residual may influence the cover crop that you can plant following that cash crop. It includes when you're going to plant the cover, how long you're going to let it grow, when and how you're going to terminate it. So all of those things we need to be thinking about, and we can alter all of those things to have disruptions. The other thing that you can do is grazing that cover crop as often as you can with cattle, with your sheep. I would take every opportunity possible to graze your cover crops. That's very powerful. It can radically alter things, and obviously those livestock are going to help supply additional fertility for that next cash crop. The other thing you need to be thinking about is potentially greater diversity in the cash crop rotation. So I don't know if you're doing just corn and soybeans right now. And if you are, and of course, obviously in Iowa, that's the norm, right? Corn, beans, corn, beans, corn, beans. But there's a lot of other things you can introduce there, obviously small grains, things like that. And when you can introduce small grains, then you also introduce the opportunity on given acres on a rotational basis to introduce not just the cool season cover crops, but also now and then a warm season cover crop. That can also radically alter what's happening and give you another disruption there. Another thing that you can be thinking about is bale grazing on some acres every year. And bale grazing can rapidly build carbon, organic matter, and fertility and biology in the soil. So immediately, without knowing more of your context, those are some of the things just right off the top of my head, Dan, that would be very beneficial for you.
Thank you.
Feel free, anybody, just to step in and unmute yourself and ask your questions, or type it in if you don't want to ask it. I'll gladly read it out for Alan as well. One thing I'll throw out there just for a little conversation, Alan, is a lot of times with sheep roosters you hear, can't graze the tall stuff. Sheep won't like to graze the tall stuff, tall forage. So what have you found in your grazing systems across the country? How are folks handling that, grazing tall forage or mature forage?
I guess first thing I would have to say is be quiet, Luke. Don't tell my sheep that. Because they're grazing tall pretty much all the time. Now, we have a lot of diversity, but we built that diversity. Okay, we didn't plant it just like it wasn't planted in the example in the desert that I talked about. It resulted from the latent seed bank and our adaptive grazing practices and implementing the rule of disruption. So we have now documented on our farm more than 150 different plant species that are growing there. And so pretty much for the vast majority of the year, Luke, our pastures are, pretty close to waist high. Okay. And a lot of times higher than that, but we've got lots and lots of diversity. And we've got multiple stories and multiple plant leaf architecture. So we have a whole bunch of different plants these sheep can select from a low story to an intermediate story to a high story. And what we find is that they actually graze all three of those stories. And typically what they'll do is when we first turn them into a paddock, they'll graze high initially. That's what we find. So they'll reach up and graze whatever they want to at that point. Then they'll start paying attention to the intermediate stories, and then finally to the lower growing stories. So that's what we're experiencing. And we also know that our sheep really love our forbs. And we have a lot of forbs that have come up in our latent seed bank, and the sheep just go after those pretty hard. And many of these forbs are highly medicinal in nature, and they also have a lot of anti-parasitic properties. So we have not dewormed our sheep in a long time. And they're just fine. There's no issues. We also don't trim feet, and we're in the hot, humid, wet Southeast. Okay. So we're not deworming, we're not trimming feet. We have, through adaptive grazing and regenerative practices and having pastures that are highly diverse and highly medicinal, in nature, we're finding that, we don't need to do those things anymore. So yes, you can graze high, but you really do need to build diversity for that to be highly successful. Okay. So you've got to start thinking about building diversity into your pastures.
I think I'd add into that too, Alan. A lot of times people want to see all their nice, pretty animals out there. And as they switch to these grazing systems, there's obviously going to be some fallout, so you've done your due diligence here to select for what lines, what specific lines that are performing and doing well in this. So it still comes down to you can be a great forage manager, but you still have to have good stockmanship to be able to select for those genetics that are going to perform as well.
That's exactly correct, Luke. And you have to let that occur. Okay. You cannot make excuses for your sheep or your cattle or your goats or anything else. You've got to let that fallout occur and be ruthless in your culling. Just get rid of those that you consistently have to deworm, that you're having to trim feet, that are poor doers. They're not maintaining their flesh. They're not breeding back like they should. Don't manage for those, and don't prop them up. That's always going to cost you money. And that goes back to epigenetics and epigenetic selection. If I'm propping up my sheep or propping up my cattle or my other species of livestock, then I am absolutely doing epigenetic selection, but I'm selecting for negative epigenetics. But if I'm not propping them up and I'm culling like I need to, and I'm keeping only those that are performing within my environment without all of these inputs, then I'm doing the opposite. I am implementing very positive epigenetic selection, and I'm building herds and flocks that are pretty much trouble-free, are highly resilient, and have tremendous longevity.
Yeah, and I'll be the first to raise my hand on that. I've battled it myself early on, Alan, especially when it comes to grazing annuals and annual cover crops. And I see that I'm going to tie this into a question that came into the chat here. So foot issues like that, I ran into a brick wall with that one year when I started grazing annual cover crops. And after knowing what I know now, it come down to too high protein, not enough dry matter out there to help balance that out. So after I started calling out those genetics that I had continuous issues with, I'm problem free now. So I can graze those lush cover crops, but it still doesn't take from the fact that we need to have some more dry matter out there to help balance that whole system out. But that kind of goes into this question here, talking about hairy vetch, and is it going to cause problems in sheep? Hairy vetch causing problems in sheep.
Okay. You get the same question with cattle. All right. So it's not just sheep, it's cattle. So here's the deal. If you've got fields that are pretty much monoculture hairy vetch, can you have a problem with cattle and sheep? Yes, absolutely. But why? Because it's pretty much monoculture hairy vetch. The problem, folks, is not hairy vetch. It's that it's dominant in the stand, highly dominant in the stand. So hairy vetch is wonderful. Hairy vetch actually fixes 3 times the nitrogen in the soil that clovers do. Okay. So I love hairy vetch. But I've got hairy vetch as a part of dozens and dozens of other different plant species. And because of that, we never have an issue with it. The sheep are consuming that, but they're also consuming many other plant species along with it.
Any other questions, folks?
I guess I have a question, and my question was, is there any plants that taint the meat, the flavor of the meat? We graze a lot of leafy spurge, and then I butchered one hogget that was like 13 months old, and he was really strong flavored. And then I read about alfalfa taint, and I was just kind of curious how that works.
That's a really good question. Appreciate you asking that. So I've been grass finishing, beef, lamb, all of that, and doing pasture pigs and poultry again since the 1990s. And look, I've made probably every mistake in the book that a person can make. I flew by the seat of my pants for a lot of years in this and learned a lot. Probably my only redeeming quality here is persistence. I just never ever gave up. Whenever I would make a mistake, I would try to determine what caused that mistake and how do I correct it, rather than just saying, well, I don't know how to do this, I give up. So here's what we have found is that when you have monocultures or near monocultures that our animals are consuming, if they're consuming a whole bunch of any one plant species, there is a lot of opportunity for tainted flavors, all flavors. And it's not just things like leafy spurge, but wheat, pasture, if it's just wheat, can produce all flavor. Fescue can produce all flavor. And a whole host of other things can produce an all flavor in a finished product. But where you've got a lot more diversity and they're not eating just one predominant plant species, but they're eating from dozens of different plants every day, you'll never have an all flavor, ever. That pretty much totally eradicates that. And it does 2 other very important things. If you're like us and you're producing and selling meat and eggs, number one is when they graze higher diversity plant species, then you get a much higher phytonutrient profile. And we've done that analysis over and over, so we know what those numbers are. You get much, much higher phytonutrients. And I'm talking to the tune of 200 to 400% higher. Okay. So it's not just a little bit, this is a lot. And then the second thing that happens is that you get this incredibly robust flavor profile. So not only is there not any tainting or off flavor, but you get this flavor profile that people absolutely fall in love with. And we also market to a lot of restaurants and work with a lot of chefs. And the chefs just love, these meats and eggs and all of that from animals that are foraging on highly diverse pastures. One of the first things they say when they try it is, wow, I've never tasted meat like this, or I've never tasted eggs like this. And they discover they have to use very, very little seasonings. They don't need the sauces and the marinades and the seasonings, and all of that. The meat stands up on its own, and they love that.
Cool. Thank you. And thanks
Yes,
for
sir.
your time.
Thank you.
I would also kind of like, I guess, to follow up maybe a little bit if we have time. the sheep kind of get addicted to the leafy spurge, they say. Is there about the only way to manage that's just smaller pastures? They almost seems like they won't hardly eat red clover, but the leafy spurge they love. And there's a lot of grass too, mostly like brome and orchard type grass. So
Okay, like smooth brome and all of that in there.
yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. So number one, you're right. Okay. And I've seen that as well. So here's the deal. Number one, you can use the sheet to be able to, dilute out the leafy spurge and to encourage other things to grow in there and to begin to outcompete the spurge. Okay. But don't use your finishers to do that. All right. Use your ewes to do that. And put them in those areas where you have a lot of spurge, put them in under density and put them in under long, narrow paddocks where you can get a lot of good trample effect and a lot of biological shedding and manure and urine, laid down and all of that from them. And when you do that, then you'll get you'll sort of set the spurge back, and that will stimulate other plants to then begin to outcompete it. And so on your finishing lambs, especially that last 60 to 90 days, keep them away from the spurge and put them on something else, and then use your ewes and that kind of thing for where you've got a high dominance of spurge.
Well, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Okay, Luke, I've got a question.
Let her rip, Pat.
Alan, can you keep that flavor for 12 months like you described? Even on, because you won't have the same plant species in 6 months, but your diversity will take care of it. Does it change much?
So the answer to your question is yes, you can absolutely keep the robustness of flavor. Okay. So you'll maintain a very robust flavor profile and a high phytonutrient content profile when you have that diversity, year round. What will change is the flavor profile itself. But that's not a problem as long as it's a very good flavor profile. Okay. Your customers will never, ever complain. As a matter of fact, they like that. It's sort of like, if anyone is a wine connoisseur, on the webinar tonight, there's not just one kind of wine and one flavor of wine, right? I mean, there's a whole huge array, and wine connoisseurs celebrate that. They want the differences and the nuances and all of that. We actually want that in our meats as well. Again, customers really love that. And they're not expecting what we're taught. We're often taught, well, they want it to taste exactly the same every time. No, they don't. That's boring. I don't either. I want a little bit of nuance in the flavor profile. Again, as long as it's good, that's a great experience.
Very good. Well, I think for the sake of time, we'll have time for one more question. If anybody has one more question, ask Alan here briefly. Otherwise, we'll be signing off. So the first person to chime in
Yeah,
can have their question.
I got a question. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
sir.
Yeah, this is Sonny McKenzie. I got an opportunity to graze some alfalfa fields coming this summer, and it's pretty monoculture alfalfa, and I wondered if I'm headed for a wreck or if there's some opportunity with what I'm thinking.
Okay. And I'm always going to be straight up. And that's going to worry me some, okay, to be quite honest with you. If it's monoculture alfalfa, number one, your sheep are going to be, and especially depending on the maturity of that alfalfa when you're grazing it, they're going to get an awful lot of protein, and they're going to be out of balance relative to protein to energy. And too much protein in the diet results in high circulating uric acid levels in their body. And that will produce an off flavor in the end product. Number one, if you're going to be harvesting off of the alfalfa, you have a high likelihood of an off flavor. Number two, with that high nitrogen level in the body or uric acid level in the body, it creates subclinical stress in the sheep. And if they're exposed to any type of pathogen or bacterium, virus, whatever, they're going to be more susceptible to disease. Okay, because of that. So they're going to have a subclinical stress. They could also, depending on conditions, they potentially could bloat. So there are a number of issues that you can face there. So if you're going to graze that, if there's anything outside of, and I don't know if this is under pivot or whatever, but if there's anything outside of that alfalfa pivot or that alfalfa pasture that you can graze and you can go back and forth, I would advise that. Or if you can't do that, then I would, you're going to have to supplement with a really good mixed grass hay, something like that, and make sure they're eating that hay. But if it were me, I would avoid grazing straight alfalfa.
Hey, Sonny, is this a phasing out stand where it's older, like where they might be able to interseed or drill in like a warm season grass to maybe help offset that?
Yeah,
or what else?
yeah, part of it is, but part of it's pretty new. Is there something a guy could plant in there to compete with that, like to grow with the alfalfa?
Yeah, so we've actually done that a lot, Sonny. Where are you located, Sonny?
Eastern Oregon.
Okay, Eastern Oregon. All right. So out in the western states in the Intermountain area and all of that, we've worked with a ton of alfalfa pivots. And so what we do is we go in and we plant highly diverse annual mixes in there. Particularly what I like, and you said you're going to graze this in the summertime, I want to plant a highly diverse warm season mix in there. Okay. Now, what you would want to do is probably go in and take a cutting off of it first, then immediately seed the warm season mix. And you want to seed the warm season mix after soil temperatures are 60 degrees or higher. And we can help you with designing a mix that'll work real well for you. But we've been pretty darn successful with doing that and putting a warm season mix in there. And it'll grow pretty well, and it'll really dilute out the alfalfa. It'll create a lot of good aggregation in the soil. And it will actually, especially if it's sort of an older, stale alfalfa stand, even the alfalfa, it'll begin to rejuvenate that. And not to the point where the alfalfa takes over, but the old alfalfa will start growing again like it's a 2-year-old stand. And we've seen that repeatedly. So, going in with a good warm season annual mix is a good way to help dilute out that alfalfa and to create a really good grazing situation.
Okay. Right. Sense.
Good question, Sonny. Like I said, I think that depends on what the maturity of that alfalfa stand is more than anything. It depends on who the landowner is and what their feelings are on that. But if it's an older stand, I'd have no problem, like Alan said, going there with that diverse warm season mix. But if it's a new virgin stand, first, second year stand, I'd probably be very careful on that myself. So hopefully that gives you a little clearance and guidance there. But very good question. I guess if there's nothing else or no other burning questions, for the sake of time, we will sign off. I want to say thank you for everybody joining us this evening. Thank you, Alan, for your time and information. It was very useful, and everybody should be able to take something home from this and implement it and set your guys' selves up for great success. So with that, again, thank you, everybody. This will be recorded again and put it on our website. Any other questions? If you feel like you lacked or whatever, email me. I'll be glad to get them to Alan as well and get them covered for you as well. So with that, thank you, everybody. Take care and have a good night.
Thanks.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.